They thought taking his machines would end him, that without a single engine left in his shed, he'd be finished before spring. But what no one at the bank realized as they hauled away millions of dollars worth of equipment was that Tom Halbrook had already made peace with losing everything, and more dangerously, he had already decided what he would become without it. For 30 years, Tom had built his farm the way most farmers in western Kansas did, slowly, stubbornly, and with a kind of quiet pride that didn't need to be spoken out loud. He inherited just under 600 acres from his father, expanded it year by year through careful purchases and long nights spent studying crop prices, and eventually turned it into a 5,000-acre operation that ran like clockwork, at least on the surface. His fields stretched further than most in the county, his yields were consistent, and his equipment, 6 late-model combines, for massive tractors, and a full suite of precision planting systems, was the kind of setup other farmers stopped to admire when they drove past. But what they didn't see was the math behind it all, the layers of loans stacked carefully but precariously beneath the success, the financing agreements that made each new piece of equipment possible while quietly tightening the margin for error. For years, it worked because everything worked. Rain came when it needed to, prices held steady enough, and Tom kept pushing forward, reinvesting, upgrading, expanding, always believing that staying competitive meant staying ahead. Then came the drought, the kind that didn't just reduce yields but hollowed them out completely, followed by a market drop that cut into what little profit remained, and finally the interest rate increases that turned manageable payments into something far heavier. By the time winter arrived, Tom wasn't just behind, he was exposed. The bank had been patient at first. They'd worked with him before, knew his history, respected the scale of what he'd built, but patience in lending has limits, and those limits were now sitting in a file folder with his name on it. They called him in, laid out the situation in calm, professional terms, and offered what they called paths forward. Though to Tom they all felt like different versions of the same outcome. Restructure under tighter conditions that would leave him with even less flexibility, sell off parcels of land to reduce the debt, or liquidate assets, specifically his equipment, to cover what he owed. The suggestion to sell land didn't last long. Tom shut that down almost immediately, not with anger, but with a firmness that made it clear it wasn't negotiable, because that land wasn't just acreage. It was history, it was his father's work, and the one thing he had always promised himself he would never give up. That left the equipment, and even then, Tom didn't agree right away. He asked for time, went home, and spent nights sitting at his kitchen table with numbers spread out in front of him, not just looking at what he owed, but at what everything actually cost him to maintain, to operate, to keep running at the scale he had built. What he saw wasn't just debt, it was dependency, every machine tied to a payment, every upgrade tied to another obligation, every season dependent on everything going exactly right. By the time he called the bank back, his voice was steady, almost too steady, and he told them he wouldn't fight the liquidation. That answer surprised them. Most farmers in his position pushed back, negotiated, delayed, tried to hold on to at least part of their operation, but Tom didn't argue terms, didn't ask for extensions. He simply agreed. So the process moved quickly, faster than anyone in the county expected, and on a cold February morning, just as the ground was beginning to think about thawing, the trucks arrived. They came in a line, one after another, heavy trailers pulling into his yard with the kind of efficiency that only comes when something has already been decided. Neighbors noticed. Immediately, in farming communities, movement like that doesn't go unnoticed, and within an hour, a few pickups were parked along the road, people watching from a distance as if they were witnessing something they didn't quite want to believe. Tom was there the whole time, standing near the edge of the yard, hands buried in his jacket pockets, not saying much as crews moved around him, loading each machine with practiced precision. One combine after another disappeared onto trailers, then the tractors, then the planters. Each piece of equipment that had once represented progress now reduced to collateral being reclaimed. A bank representative stood off to the side, clipboard in hand, checking items off a list, occasionally glancing toward Tom as if expecting some kind of reaction, but it never came. No raised voice, no last-minute plea, not even visible frustration, just a quiet presence, watching it happen. That silence made people uncomfortable. It didn't fit the situation, didn't match the scale of what was being taken, And more than one person would later say that was the moment they knew something about it wasn't normal. By midday, the yard was almost empty, the noise of engines fading as the last truck pulled away, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks in the dirt and a stretch of open space where millions of dollars worth of machinery had once stood. The bank considered it a difficult but necessary action, a way to recover losses and close out a risky position before planting season began, because without equipment, there was no way Tom could operate at his previous scale, and without that scale, there was no realistic path for him to generate the kind of revenue needed to recover. In their view, it was the end of the story, or at least the beginning of an inevitable decline. Land sales, downsizing, maybe even an exit from farming altogether. Around town, the narrative formed just as quickly. Tom Halbrook was done. Another example of how quickly things could turn, another reminder of how thin the line really was. But as the dust settled and the trucks disappeared down the road, Tom didn't follow them, didn't make any calls, didn't try to explain himself to the neighbors who eventually drifted away. Instead, he turned back toward his house, walked past the now empty shed, and closed the door behind him as if nothing essential had been taken at all, because in a way that no one else could yet see, the thing they believed had been stripped from him was the very thing he had already decided to let go. For weeks after the last truck disappeared down the road, nothing about Tom Halbrook's farm made sense, and that silence, more than the seizure itself, was what convinced most people he was finished. Spring didn't wait, not for banks, not for debt, and certainly not for a farmer with empty sheds. And across western Kansas the season moved forward exactly as it always did. Engines roared back to life, planters cut straight, perfect lines across thousands of acres, and the long days began where timing meant everything and delay meant loss. But on Tom's land, there was no movement, no hum of machinery, no dust trails stretching across fields, just stillness. Neighbors driving past slowed down without meaning to, glancing over at ground that should have been worked already, trying to make sense of how a farm that large could sit untouched this late into the season. The conversation started quietly, then grew more certain with each passing day. "He's not coming back from this," some said, while others framed it more bluntly. "You don't lose everything like that and recover." Even the bank assumed the same. Internally, his account was already being treated as a closed chapter, a situation resolved before it could become worse. But what none of them saw, what no one was close enough to notice, was that Tom hadn't stopped working. He had simply changed what work looked like. Instead of operating across fields, he stayed close to home, spending long hours inside his old machine shed, the one structure the bank had no interest in taking. At first, it was just him, sorting through tools, pulling out parts that had been sitting untouched for years, pieces of older equipment that had once been considered obsolete. Then, gradually, others began to show up, not hired crews in uniforms, not dealership technicians, but local mechanics, a retired welder from town, a couple of younger guys who knew small engines better than spreadsheets. They didn't arrive all at once, and they didn't draw attention. They came one at a time, trucks pulling in quietly, doors closing behind them, work happening out of sight. From the outside, it didn't look like much, certainly not like the kind of operation that could replace what had been taken, but inside that shed, something methodical was happening. Tom wasn't trying to rebuild what he had lost. He was building something else entirely. Old tractors started appearing on the property, not in a single purchase but in pieces, sourced from auctions, neighboring counties, even from farmers who had long since upgraded and left their older machines sitting idle. None of them matched, none of them were impressive, and most people who saw them would have dismissed them immediately. But Tom saw something different. Machines that could be understood, repaired, controlled without permission from anyone else. Day after day, the small group worked, stripping down engines, replacing worn components, fabricating parts when they couldn't find them, turning what looked like scrap into something functional again. Still, the fields remained untouched, and that only reinforced the narrative that had already taken hold. By the time planting season was well underway for everyone else, Tom was weeks behind, a gap that in farming terms can feel impossible to close. And yet, one morning, without any announcement or visible shift, movement finally began. It didn't come in the form people expected. No line of identical machines moving in perfect formation, No synchronized operation covering hundreds of acres at a time. Instead, it came in fragments. One tractor started working a section near the north boundary, slower than modern equipment. Its path, not perfectly straight, but steady. Another began on the opposite side of the property later that afternoon. By the end of the week, there were several of them, spread out, each covering smaller portions of land, not coordinated by software or centralized systems, but by Tom himself, moving between them, adjusting, monitoring, keeping everything in motion. It looked inefficient, almost chaotic compared to the precision operations happening around him, and for a while, it seemed to confirm what everyone already believed, that he was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. But there was one difference that didn't show up immediately, one detail too small to notice at first. Nothing stopped. While other farms relied on large, complex machines that could cover ground quickly, but depended on everything functioning perfectly, Tom's operation had no single point of failure. If one tractor needed attention, the others kept going. If something broke, it was fixed on site, often the same day, without waiting for parts approvals or dealership schedules. There were no software locks, no remote diagnostics, no delays tied to systems outside his control. And as the season progressed, that difference began to matter. Midway through planting, one of the larger operations nearby lost critical time when a key piece of equipment went down, the repair delayed by parts availability and service backlogs. Another farm faced GPS calibration issues that slowed their entire process, forcing adjustments that rippled across their schedule. Individually, these problems weren't catastrophic, but together, they created gaps, delays that added up in ways that couldn't be recovered easily. Meanwhile, Tom's fields, though planted later and with less precision, continued to move forward without interruption. It wasn't fast, it wasn't perfect, but it was consistent, and consistency in a season built on narrow windows carries a weight that speed alone can't match. People began to notice, though few said it out loud at first. The same neighbors who had written him off now found themselves watching again, this time with a different kind of curiosity, trying to understand how something that looked so inefficient on the surface could still be progressing when more advanced operations were facing setbacks. Even then, most assumed it wouldn't hold, that eventually the lack of scale would catch up to him, that being behind at the start would mean being behind at the end. But Tom didn't seem concerned with catching up, and that was the part no one could quite grasp. He wasn't trying to win the season the way he used to. He was simply refusing to lose it the way they expected. By the time harvest season arrived, the difference between what people expected and what was actually happening on Tom Halbrook's farm had grown too large to ignore, and the same quiet operation that had once been dismissed as a desperate attempt to stay afloat was now being watched with a kind of uneasy attention. Fields that should have lagged behind were standing ready, not perfectly uniform, not as visually precise as the neighboring operations, but complete, planted, maintained, and now yielding. Around him, the farms that had started strong were dealing with a different kind of pressure, one that didn't show up all at once but revealed itself in moments. A combine waiting on a replacement part that hadn't arrived, a tractor sidelined for days because a certified technician was booked out, systems that required approvals, updates, or diagnostics before they could return to work. None of these problems were catastrophic on their own, but harvest doesn't reward delays, and every hour lost created a tension that spread across entire operations. Tom's farm, by contrast, moved the same way it had all season, piece by piece, machine by machine, steady and uninterrupted. His equipment didn't cover ground as quickly, and his methods didn't look efficient by modern standards. But there was something else there, something that didn't break under pressure: continuity. When one machine needed attention, another took its place. When something wore down, it was repaired in the same shed where it had been rebuilt months earlier. There were no calls placed to distant service centers, no waiting for authorization, no uncertainty about whether something could be fixed in time. Everything that needed to happen stayed within reach. By the end of harvest, the outcome was clear in a way numbers alone couldn't fully capture. Tom hadn't produced the highest yield in the county, and he hadn't finished first, but he had finished without interruption, without emergency costs, and without adding a single dollar of new debt. And that was when the situation began to shift beyond the fields and back into the offices where decisions had originally been made. The bank, which had long since closed his case in their internal discussions, started to take notice. not because of a dramatic turnaround, but because of the consistency they hadn't expected. Reports showed that his operation, despite losing its entire fleet, had stabilized in a way that reduced risk instead of increasing it. Expenses were lower, projections were more predictable, and the absence of large financing obligations had changed the structure of his entire business. It wasn't growth in the traditional sense, but it was something arguably more valuable: resilience. So 6 months after the day they had taken everything from his yard, the same bank requested a meeting. This time, the tone was different. There were no ultimatums, no predefined options laid out across the table, just questions. They wanted to understand how an operation they had assumed would collapse had instead reorganized itself into something more stable than before. Tom sat across from them in the same calm way he had months earlier, but now the silence carried a different weight. He explained what he had done in simple terms, not presenting it as a strategy or a breakthrough, but as a shift in priorities. He had reduced dependence on any single system, lowered his exposure to debt, and built an operation that could function without external control. He wasn't trying to scale back up to what he had lost, he said. He was building something that couldn't be taken the same way again. One of the executives, looking down at the numbers and then back at Tom, finally asked the question that had been sitting unspoken since the meeting began. "When we seized your equipment, why didn't you fight it?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He leaned back slightly, as if considering how to put something into words that had already been clear to him for a long time. "Because it wasn't helping me anymore," he said finally. "It just looked like it was." The room went quiet, not because the answer was complicated, but because it wasn't. Everything that had once defined his success, scale, speed, advanced systems, had also defined his risk, and when that structure was removed, what remained was something smaller, less impressive on the surface, but far more stable underneath. The bank hadn't just taken his machines, they had taken the weight attached to them, the obligations that had been tightening around his operation year after year. And in doing so, they had unintentionally given him the space to rebuild without those constraints. By the time the meeting ended, there was no formal declaration, no dramatic reversal, but the dynamic had changed completely. The same institution that had once seen him as a liability now saw something else entirely, a model that, while unconventional, carried far less risk than the one it had replaced. Later that evening, as the sun dropped low over his fields, Tom walked back toward the shed where it had all started. Inside, the line of mismatched tractors stood exactly where they had been left, worn, imperfect, each one carrying marks of the work it had done. There was no uniformity, no polished appearance, nothing that would draw attention from someone passing by. But every one of them had earned its place. He reached out and rested his hand on the hood of the oldest one, feeling the rough metal under his palm, then climbed up and turned the key. The engine started immediately, a steady, familiar sound filling the space without hesitation. No delays, no permissions, no uncertainty, just a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. For the first time in years, there was no calculation running in the back of his mind, no thought about payments, approvals, or what might happen if something outside his control failed at the wrong moment. The operation was smaller now, yes, and it didn't carry the same outward appearance of success, but it was his in a way it hadn't been before. Fully, completely, without conditions. And as he shut the engine off and stepped back into the quiet of the shed, it became clear that what everyone else had seen as the moment he lost everything was, in reality, the moment he stopped risking it all.